So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening speakers. In a few moments, Halvard Gorseth, Head of Anti-Discrimination at the Council of Europe's Department, will join us to welcome you all, followed by Triantafyllis Lucarellis, Chair of the Council's Steering Group on Anti-Discrimination, Diversity and Inclusion, and then followed in turn by our keynote speaker and a great friend of our department and a huge asset to Ireland in all sorts of ways and to Europe, Michael O'Flaherty, the Director of the European Fundamental Rights Agency. But before that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, and a good friend of mine, Roger O'Gorman.
Thanks very much, Rag. Accordia, friends, welcome to Ivy House. And I'm really pleased to be here today to open this important Council of Europe Roundtable on the right to life, security and protection from violence. And I'd really like to express my congratulations and thanks to all of you who've been involved in making today a reality, but in particular to the Council of Europe's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Unit, together with the working group of the Steering Committee on Anti-Discrimination, Diversity, Inclusion, on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And I know we're going to be addressed later on by our Council of Europe colleagues, Halvard Gorseth and Triantafyllis Lucarellis, as well as by our own Michael O'Flaherty, the Director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And as we gather today to counter hatred and affirm the most fundamental of human rights, I am reminded of the many challenges that the LGBTI+ communities around the world continue to face. As we know, in 2021, the Fundamental Rights Agency conducted a major survey of LGBTI+ Europeans, and 1 in 10 of every respondent reported being the victim of attack over the previous 4 years. And 4 in 10 reported being subject to active harassment, and fewer than, I think, 4% had actually reported that harassment to the police. So a clear lack of confidence in the ability of police forces to address this. And it is for these reasons today that we're gathered as policymakers, as practitioners, as academics, as activists, as politicians. We're gathered here to discuss the urgent need for action to address this sort of hatred, this sort of intolerance. As you know, Ireland assumed the presidency of the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers 5 months ago, at a point of profound crisis on our continent and a point of profound challenges for the Council. And within our time in the presidency, we've been very much committed to refocusing the Council's efforts on the institution's core values. We've convened over 50 conferences, seminars and public events such as this today. We've gathered justice ministers from across the continent to agree a new Dublin Declaration on countering violence against women. We've welcomed the election of Judge Siofra O'Leary as the first Irish citizen and the first woman as President of the European Court of Human Rights. And Ireland has also led the Committee of Ministers in urging a comprehensive international legal response to the crime of aggression against Ukraine perpetrated by Russia. At the core of Ireland's presidency of the Committee of Ministers is a recommitment to the institution's founding freedoms and human rights protection for civilians across Europe. Slovenia made history this month, as we know, as the first Eastern European country to establish marriage equality. In 2015, the people of Ireland voted overwhelmingly for the same right. And inspired by the change that this groundbreaking referendum inaugurated in Irish society, and conscious of the work yet to do, Ireland has made protecting LGBTI+ rights a priority for our presidency. In June, we invited leading LGBTI+ activists to address the Committee of Ministers for the first time. Last month, we participated in Europride in Belgrade, having earlier called on the government of Serbia to reconsider its plans to postpone or to cancel the parade. And last week, Ireland focused an informal meeting of the Committee of Ministers on developing new strategies to promote tolerance and to combat hate. Internationally, we may remain committed to collective efforts to ensure the protection and the advancements of the human rights of LGBTI+ people, including through continued support for the Council of Europe's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Unit, and engagement with the Steering Committee on Diversity, Anti-Discrimination and Inclusion, together with its working group. It has also included involvement in the work of the European Governmental LGBTI Focal Points Network. Our commitment to defending the rights of LGBTI+ people can be seen most recently in our support for the declaration emanating from the recent conference of the Equality Rights Coalition in Buenos Aires, and the statement by the United Nations LGBTI core group calling for an end to violence and discrimination faced by LGBTI+ people. Continued collaboration across multiple levels is crucial to achieving our shared objectives. Domestically, Ireland continues to strive to be at the forefront of real, positive and impactful change in the lives of LGBTI+ communities. Ireland enshrined protections for transgendered persons in the Gender Recognition Act in 2015. In 2018, we became the first country in the world to launch a national LGBTI youth strategy, and this was followed in 2019 by Ireland's first national LGBTI+ inclusion strategy. While Ireland has become a more diverse, a more welcoming country in recent decades, there continues to be challenges. LGBTI+ persons continue to experience hate crime and harassment. And those of us in the community know, particularly over the last year, there has been a deeply concerning increase in these incidents. And these types of attacks, they cannot and they will not be tolerated. And in this context, I'm pleased to announce that this week, the Irish government has approved the publication of the Criminal Justice Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offences Bill 2022. And this new bill, proposed by my colleague, the Minister for Justice, creates new aggravated forms of certain existing criminal offences, hate crimes, where those offences are motivated by hatred of a protected characteristic. And these protected characteristics include gender orientation, sex characteristics, and gender, including gender expression or gender identity. The bill also strengthens the laws around incitement to hatred or hate speech. The bill has been carefully developed to ensure that it is victim-centred and is effective in securing convictions where serious crimes are committed. This is a hugely important piece of legislation which will better support our police service in prosecuting and securing convictions for hate crimes and hate speech. More importantly, it will inaugurate much stronger remedies for victims, and it confirms that Irish society will not tolerate hate crime or hate speech. More will be, this legislation will be officially published later on today by the Minister for Justice, and I know its publication is something that is eagerly awaited by members across our LGBTI+ community. Later on today, you'll also hear from An Garda Síochána, the Irish police force, about diversity training for its members and also improved data collection. The statistics that have been collected by An Garda Síochána for 2021 show that in that year there were 448 hate crimes or hate-related instances committed in our country. And as we know, those are the ones that were actually reported to the Gardaí. Under the National LGBTI+ Inclusion Strategy, An Garda Síochána is working to increase significantly the reporting of hate crimes by members of the LGBTI+ community. Its key strategy is to build relationships of trust between the police force and LGBTI+ persons. The government recognises that collaboration between government, civil society and community organisations is vital to achieve effective service provision for LGBTI+ communities. Last year, my own department allocated €1.5 million to support LGBTI+ projects through grant funding. The 2022 funding call includes a new core support feature, which will enable LGBTI+ NGOs to maintain and enhance existing services and initiatives. And we made that change on foot of representations that were made to us on the steering committee that oversees the implementation of the LGBTI+ inclusion strategy. My department also funded the provision of tailored legal advice and advocacy to LGBTI+ people via specialised legal advice clinic. This was launched earlier this year by the Free Legal Advice Centre, and you'll hear more about that later today. My department has also been leading on developing and implementing an LGBTI+ research programme identified in consultation with LGBTI+ NGOs and a landscape analysis of existing research. I'm also firmly committed to banning the harmful practice of conversion therapy in our country. Commissioned research is currently underway, which will inform the legislation to ban the practice in Ireland, and my department has been working closely with the Office of the Attorney General in terms of identifying the key legal issues that will have to be addressed in the legislation implementing that ban. The government has undertaken a series of actions to tackle the prejudice which can lead to hate crime and hate speech. It appointed an independent anti-racism committee formed of experts and representatives of civil society to develop a new national action plan against racism. And I look forward to shortly bringing forward the NAPAR, the National Action Plan Against Racism, and an implementation strategy to government for approval. So to conclude, I'd like to reaffirm our commitment to creating a safe, fair and inclusive Ireland where people are supported to flourish and to live inclusive, healthy and fulfilling lives, whatever their sexual orientation, their gender identity or expression, or their sex characteristics. We strongly recognise, value and commit to continued collective collaboration to this end. Today's roundtable enables us to renew our shared commitment to advancing and to protecting LGBTI+ rights. And it's an opportunity for us to have an important discussion which has the potential both to deepen our understanding of the current challenges that we all know exist, but also to provide a forum for exchanging new ideas for strengthening protections for LGBTI+ communities across Europe. So I want to wish you well in your deliberations today, and I look forward to meeting you all again this evening at the RIA. Thank you very much.
So, dear Minister, dear experts and representatives of national and international institutions and civil society organisations, I would like to thank Minister O'Gorman and the Irish authorities for hosting this European Roundtable here in Dublin as part of the Presidency of Ireland of the Committee Ministers of the Council of Europe, and in particular for including also the third objective of your presidency to foster a Europe of welcome, inclusion and diversity. I'd also like to thank the United Kingdom for contributing to its organization. As you know, the Council of Europe has worked for a long time to raise awareness and to combat hate-motivated violence, including racist, religious, gender-based and LGBTI-phobic crime. Before we go in depth into the topic of combating SOGIESC-based hate crime in today's thematic sessions, I will take the opportunity of this opening address to set the scene, so to speak, from the Council of Europe perspective, and to remind us of the relevant existing standards set by the organization's bodies and mechanisms. First of all, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights. Through its jurisprudence, the European Court of Human Rights has developed the doctrine of positive obligations to conduct an effective investigation of hate crimes. It derives from these positive obligations that additional duties, both procedural and substantive duties, are placed on Council of Europe member states when addressing such crimes. This extends also to cases of discrimination by association, where the victim of an offence is targeted not because of this person's actual or perceived status or characteristics, but because of the presumed association or affiliation with another person who has such status or characteristics. The court's case law is clear about the importance of unmasking hate motivation and LGBT-phobic motivation, and it warns against the consequences of failing to do so. Just recently, the court has held that member states must ensure that violent attacks motivated by hostility towards a victim's actual or presumed sexual orientation must be treated as aggravated in criminal law terms. Our second relevant standard is, of course, also the 2010 Committee of Ministers recommendation on combating discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which builds on the most important articles of the European Convention on Human Rights and the key findings of the court as they relate to issues affecting LGBT persons. The right to life, security and protection from violence is the first topic addressed in this recommendation, which provides that measures to combat hate crime must include effective and prompt investigations into alleged hate crimes against LGBT persons, and in particular in cases where the suspects are law enforcement officials. Member states must also have relevant and effective laws that allow the courts to take anti-LGBT bias motivation into account as an aggravating circumstance when determining the penalty. Moreover, victims and witnesses of SOGIESC-related hate crimes must be encouraged to report these crimes, and law enforcement officials must have the skills and knowledge to identify hate-motivated cases and to support and assist victims and witnesses. The authorities must collect relevant data on the occurrence and nature of discrimination and intolerance on grounds of SOGI, especially on hate crimes. And finally, with regard to the right to life, security and protection from violence, the recommendation underlines that member states are obliged to safeguard the right of freedom of expression and assembly, and especially the right to protection when exercising the right to freedom of assembly, such as pride marches. The need to combat SOGIESC-based hate crime has also been raised by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in several resolutions. In a recent resolution on combating rising hate against LGBTI people, the Assembly stresses that it is precisely when hostility is high or rising that effective criminal provisions and anti-discrimination legislation are most crucial. The resolution therefore calls on Member States to further strengthen their legislative framework. And important body of the Council of Europe in addressing hate crime is the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. ECRI monitors developments in all 46 member states of the Council of Europe and has made a significant contribution to the fight against hate crime by issuing recommendations to individual member states and identifying promising practices. ECRI recommends to explicitly include the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity and sex characteristics in criminal law provisions aimed at combating racism and intolerance. The law should provide for effective, proportionate and dissuasive sanctions. It should also make public insults, public defamation and threats committed against a person or a group of persons on account of their sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics into criminal offences. Moreover, it should provide explicitly that LGBTI-phobic motivation constitutes an aggravating circumstance for any ordinary offence. Finally, I'd like to highlight the Council of Europe's support to individual member states in their efforts to combat hate crime by assisting in the implementation of our legal standards, the Court's case law and ECRI's monitoring recommendations. Our SOGI unit organizes technical assistance for national institutions, including the police, public prosecutors' offices, educational institutions, and civil society to combat LGBTI-phobic hate crimes through awareness raising, capacity building, review of legislation and policies, and, as we are doing today, exchanges of expertise and promising practices on LGBTI-phobic hate crime. The Council of Europe is committed and stands ready to provide such assistance to all its member states to ensure that the effective protection of the rights of LGBTI persons in Europe. In addition to the standards that I have just mentioned, the elaboration of a Committee of Ministers recommendation specifically on combating hate crime will further strengthen our body or our toolbox. And I welcome very much the holding of this European Roundtable also as a contribution to this work. So let me end by wishing you a fruitful discussion and a successful roundtable.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Dear Minister O'Gorman, thank you very much to you and to your government for the commitment, the very important words we heard. Dear Halvard, Head of Department Courses, dear Michael, Director of Flaherty, dear colleagues and partners, I'm very pleased to welcome you in turn on behalf of the Council of Europe Steering Committee on Anti-Discrimination, Diversity and Inclusion to this European Roundtable. The issue that brings us together today, hate crime based on sexual orientation, gender identity and sex characteristic, is one that unfortunately remains prevalent across our region. In fact, in many member states, the figures are on the rise, calling for a reinvigorated and holistic approach to combating this vicious phenomenon. Hate crimes are indeed an especially grave form of violence, one that can kill, one that perpetuates oppression and stigma in the society and generates fear and trauma among targeted communities. As a group often scapegoated and marginalized, an alarmingly high number of LGBTI persons in Europe feels compelled to hide their sexual orientation or gender identity for fear of violence. As highlighted by the head of department, key Council of Europe resolutions and recommendations by the Committee of Ministers, the Parliamentary Assembly, and other Council of Europe human rights mechanisms recognize the specific harm and impact of discrimination and crimes against LGBTI persons, as well as the importance of supporting victims, cooperating with civil society, and training law enforcement and other criminal justice practitioners. In tackling hate crime, it is of paramount importance to understand the context of prejudice, hostility and discrimination that LGBTI persons experience and that forms the basis of such hate. There is no uniform definition of hate crime at the international level, but there is a common understanding that it's a criminal act with a bias motive. Our discussion today focuses on the bias of the perpetrator based on the victim's sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristic, be it real or perceived. In this respect, I wish to stress that the Council of Europe's Committee of Experts on Hate Crime is preparing under CDADI and the European Committee on Crime Problems a draft recommendation on combating hate crime with the aim to advance a comprehensive approach to address such crime. It is working on a definition of hate crime as well as on recommendations regarding proper investigation and assistance to victims. Earlier this year, in March, precisely March 2022, the Council of Europe Steering Committee on Anti-Discrimination, Diversity and Inclusion adopted a methodology to conduct annual thematic reviews of the implementation of the Council of Europe Recommendation 5 of 2010 on measures to combat discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. The annual thematic review culminates in two types of reports: a national report for the countries which volunteer to participate each year, and a holistic report with European-wide recommendations on the chosen theme to be adopted by the CDADI. Those thematic reports prepare the ground for the next comprehensive implementation review report on the SOGI Recommendation 5/2010, which is due in 2025. The first European-wide report, which was adopted by the CDADI in March 2022, entitled Legal Gender Recognition entitled Legal Recognition in Europe. The topic for the second thematic report, which will be based on this year's thematic review, is Right to Life, Security and Protection from Violence, specifically covering hate crimes and/or hate-motivated incidents. It is foreseen to adopt this report in spring 2023. As part of this process and to enrich the report, we are holding today's European Roundtable as a forum to stimulate exchanges share best practices, and discuss European-wide challenges and solutions on LGBTI-phobic hate crime and other LGBTI-phobic incidents. I also hope that this roundtable will provide opportunities to foster intergovernmental cooperation and to share examples of promising practices on combating SOGIESC-based hate crime, which will contribute to European-wide standards and inform national measures. At national level, the SOGI unit has already held thematic reviews and consultations on hate crimes and other hate-motivated incidents in Albania, France, and Romania. Those activities aim at supporting their efforts in advancing dialogue on possible shortcomings in addressing LGBTI-phobic hate crime and to identify priority reforms which are needed to make further progress. This process ensures the active involvement of public authorities, civil society, and national human rights institutions. Participating states also had the opportunity to showcase their achievements and are supported by the execution of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, the implementation of the recommendation addressed to them by the European Commission against racism and intolerance, ECRI, and further recommendations addressed to them as an outcome of the aforementioned activities. I trust that these processes at national level will offer opportunities for cooperation and set the agenda for reforms that could be jointly agreed upon by public authorities and civil society. I'm confident that today's open dialogue will enable and motivate more countries to improve their legislation and policies in the area covered by today's roundtable on combating LGBTI-phobic hate crime. Beyond that, I hope that today's discussion will motivate member states to push forward also in other areas which will be covered by the next comprehensive review of the implementation of the Council of Europe recommendation on measures to combat discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity, which is due in 2024. I will now end my remarks here with this overview of the existing and upcoming instruments, tools and mechanisms developed by Council of Europe, which is by no means exhaustive. I very much hope that I have contributed to laying the ground for a fruitful discussion on how to best utilize all our resources, experiences and practices, and mutually reinforce our efforts towards a Europe free from discrimination, hatred, prejudice, and violence. Thank you very much.
Minister O'Gorman, representatives of the Council of Europe, Halvard and Triantafylos, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to start with a memory. Some years ago, I was a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. It was our task to monitor compliance by states parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We did this mainly through reviews of reports and dialogues with state delegations. And I vividly recall one dialogue with one state party, which was not a Council of Europe member state, and I raised issues of violence against trans people in police detention. We'd received persistent reports of the targeting of trans people in police cells and the killing of some with complete impunity. I raised the issue, I got no answer from the delegation, and so, as we do in these proceedings, I came back to the issue in a second round. And that then triggered a response from a member of the delegation who said he didn't see the issue because he didn't see any mention of trans people in the treaty. Now, that horrific attitude back then was all too common, and it was based on that and similar incidents that a group of us got together in an exercise to map the application of human rights law and standards to the lived experience of everybody, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that exercise led to the adoption of a set of principles known as the Yogyakarta principles. Now, some of you are familiar with the principles. They've had some impact over the years. But on the basis of those principles, I was invited to Strasbourg. I was invited to give evidence in the early stages of the negotiation of what would become recommendation number 5, the so-called SOGI recommendation. And so you'll forgive me that rambling story, but it's the basis on which I'm so very glad to be at this particular event, to speak in the context of recommendation number 5 and of the highly innovative annual review and all of the related procedures. I want to express appreciation to the Council of Europe for yet again giving a global leadership example through this work. Now, the high attention that the Council of Europe has paid and continues to be paid to the range of issues, including protection from violence, is as needed today as ever. And I want to acknowledge with sadness and outrage the killing just 2 weeks ago, an hour away from where I live in Vienna, of Matus Horvat and Juraj Vankulic, who were murdered outside a gay bar in Bratislava. My agency, the Fundamental Rights Agency, as part of our commitment to work in this area, are committed to capture the lived experience of LGBTI persons, above all else, through our periodic surveys. Minister, you quoted our survey at the outset of your own words. We've conducted the survey twice, first in 2012 and most recently in late 2019, with the results published in 2020. And as a result, I'm afraid to say, rather lost, because we published in March 2020, and that was exactly when the world locked down. And so the survey has not had the attention I think it deserves. What are some of the data? But first, let me say, of course, the survey only covers EU member states, as well as 3 other countries that are observers to our agency. Well, we heard some figures from the Minister earlier. Let me come back to a few. Firstly, 58% of respondents experienced harassment in the past 5 years, either physical or online. We know that online, the most common form of harassment is sexual orientation, gender identity related, 18.2%, just 0.2% higher than hate expressed to migrants. Turning to physical violence, 11% of LGBTI people have experienced at least one violent attack in the past 5 years. This rises to 17% if you're trans, 22% if you're intersex. And generally, we see that the levels of harassment and violence are higher for younger people. And there's a very important dimension of intersectionality, which must never be forgotten. In other words, if you're Roma, if you're a migrant, if you have a disability, you're more likely to experience harassment or violence. Turning to the reporting rates, which we've heard about already, they are very worryingly low. For harassment, just 1 in 10 incidents are reported, and just 4% to the police. Coming to violence, it's 1 in 5, 20% are reported, but here, just 14% to the police. And when we ask why nobody's going to the police, the persistent answer we got from multiple countries was because people feared a homophobic treatment when they made the complaint. And then just to add to the empirical data, you don't need me to tell you that we're seeing a growing pressure on LGBTI civil society, all manner of harassment, and it'll be a focus of discussion today, which I welcome, as well as a persistent pattern of homophobic and transphobic speech from public personalities, including politicians, in a context where they just get away with it. Too few countries gather data on incidents of violence against members of the LGBTI communities. Without the data, we won't really make a difference. My agency also will continue to invest in data gathering, but it's not enough. And of course, it doesn't cover those Council of Europe states that are not members of the EU. But we will help any country, anywhere, that wants support in terms of methodologies. Secondly, it's very important to continue to invest in addressing the environment where hate is formed. We have to continue to invest in public sensitization campaigns. It's an obvious fact that attitudes in society lag behind law reform, and yet we tend to neglect that dimension. Second, we have to maintain a supportive environment for civil society, LGBTI civil society, but all civil society. We have to maintain a focus of attention on the digital space, including regarding content moderation and the taking down of hate speech. This, of course, is very challenging because we need to take the hate offline, but we have to do it in a way that respects freedom of expression. And again, here I'd offer my agency's support, including in the new zone of engaging with, monitoring, controlling, if we must, automated content moderation, which is the dominant form of content moderation today. And then, of course, we have to address the issue of our police forces. I was very impressed by what I heard about the Garda Síochána and the changes here in Ireland. We need to see that rolled out across all of our countries. We need to address what we are told persistently are incidence patterns of homophobia within police forces. We need to address it not just as good practice, but as basic discipline required of every police officer. Now, turning to the armoury of criminal law, we at the Fundamental Rights Agency would strongly encourage that states include sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics as aggravating bias motivation that would qualify a crime as a hate crime. And here again, we acknowledge with respect and appreciation this week's announcements here in Ireland. But it's not enough to have hate crime. We have to use it. We have to make sure that hate crimes are effectively recorded, investigated, and prosecuted. We at my agency are supporting EU member states to do this work. And from that experience, we've observed the need to provide police officers with detailed guidance concerning descriptions of bias indicators. It's not straightforward. Our police forces need help to turn hate crime legislation into effective policing. Police forces also need an applied monitoring definition of what hate crime looks like on the ground. And then, of course, there's the issue of reporting. We have to improve reporting rates, encourage reporting. It is about the issue of the attitude of our police forces, but we can go more, we can go further. There's the high value in deploying specialized police liaison officers. There's the potential of developing possibilities for third-party reporting of incidents. And of course, there's the imperative for all of this and everything related of working with civil society as a partner, not for civil society, but with civil society. And so as I conclude my remarks, I would say we need to be very vigilant because horrifyingly, we've seen that progress is not linear. We can go backwards as well as forwards. We've seen steps backwards in law, policy and practice. We've even seen changes to constitutions to send us backwards in recent years. So progress is not assured, it's not safe once it's secured. But I would encourage us to maintain a guarded hope. The Fundamental Rights Agency surveys offer some basis for hope. For instance, in 2012, when we asked people were they open about their LGBTI identity, 1 in 3 said that, just 1 in 3 were open. So 2/3 kept it hidden. We asked the same question in 2019, and the change was 1 in 2. So 50% were open about identity. That is a remarkable change in a relatively short period of time. But the strongest basis for hope, my friends, is personal. It's something from your own experience. And let me share with you why I remain hopeful. I'm hopeful because of the transformation of my own country, this country, Ireland. On the 23rd of May, a Saturday, 2015, I, with some people in the room, maybe Minister, you were there as well, in the Castle Yard, the counting centre for the referendum on marriage equality, we were crammed into the yard of Dublin Castle, many thousands of us. I will never forget the euphoria that day, the sense that everything is possible. And it's that spirit, that memory, that visceral moment that I had, that is why I believe that we can actually have progress that's meaningful. We can change our world. We can deliver on Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We can build a world where everyone is free and equal in dignity and in rights. Thank you.
So, Genya, how do you want to take the panel? And the Minister will have me now, and will join us later in the reception. Thank you, Michael, for those very eloquent and very moving remarks.
Tu l'entends? I will invite the panelists that are with us in the room to join me, and two of us are online. So, yes. Well, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure now to kick off the expert discussions for the rest of the day, and to benefit from such a inspiring and informing opening. We've already heard a lot about the issue, about its importance, about the challenges it presents. We just heard, and unfortunately, that the progress in this regard is not linear, and we can't take anything for granted. In fact, figures tend to incite us to double down on our efforts. We've heard about the ongoing work on past work within the Council of Europe, within the Fundamental Rights Agency, and of course, about the very topical, maybe successful legislative processes in Ireland. We also heard that so far, the definition of hate crime, the topic of today's discussion, is not a unified one. So to start, it seems only very relevant and necessary to ask ourselves really again, what exactly are we talking about? What definitions are we using? What should we include in the scope of hate crime? And to do so, understand those trends and understand better the phenomenon. Will be only as efficient as we are also aligned in those efforts, in our standards, in our policies. We heard calls already from the previous speakers about the necessity to mutually reinforce our work and our efforts. So to achieve that, I'm really pleased, and I'm very lucky to be joined in this panel by representatives of the Council of Europe Expert Committee on Hate Crime, from DG Just, from the OSCE ODIHR, and from ILGA Europe, so we can benefit from the expertise of international organizations as much as from international NGOs. So I'll start immediately by giving the floor to Stephanie Oehner. Stephanie is a lecturer at the University of Vienna, and will but especially talk to us about her role as chair of the Committee of Experts on Hate Crime of the Council of Europe, also known as the PCADCH, because we really love our acronyms at the Council of Europe. So, Stephanie, if, of course, you will tell us about the work on the preparation, about this Committee of Ministers' recommendation, and especially, I think we're interested to hear about the approach and the mandate of the committee, and then how you are going about the scope and the grounds that you will include under the hate crime recommendation. Stephanie, the floor is yours. And we do not hear you. Perhaps you forgot to unmute, or we need to.
Now, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Yes,
we
okay,
do.
thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Dear Minister, dear experts, representatives of national institutions, international institutions, and civil society organizations. I'm very honored to have been invited as chair of the Committee of Experts on Hate Crime of the Council of Europe to contribute to this event today. This event is very relevant to our work, as you've already heard in the previous speeches. In this context, I'm particularly happy that this panel also includes representatives of the EU Commission and OSCE ODIHR, which actively contribute to the work of our committee with their expertise as observers. The Experts Committee is mandated by the Committee of Ministers to prepare a draft text of recommendation on combating hate crime by the end of 2023. And as you've already heard, the committee is under the supervision of the CDADI and another steering committee, namely the Committee on Criminal Matters, the CDPC. The members of the committee consist of 5 government experts nominated by the CDADI, 5 experts nominated by the CDPC, representatives of member states as participants, and representatives of international organizations as observers. NGOs also contribute to our work. They contribute through the Council of Europe Conference of the International Non-Governmental Organizations. And I'm also very pleased that as one of these observers, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, whose director we've already heard at the beginning, also makes a valuable contribution to the work of the committee. In addition to those already mentioned, the committee has 4 independent experts whose primary task is to provide the committee with their expertise to the drafting of the recommendation for the committee's review and discussion. The committee has held 2 meetings so far. The first meeting was dedicated to the discussion of the structure and the main focus of the recommendation. And the second one, which took place from 29th to 30th of September, was dedicated to the already draft recommendation to be reviewed and amended. The discussions in the second meeting focused primarily on questions relating to the definition of hate crime, the possible legislative models, and preventive measures. Coming to the aim of the recommendation, the intended aim is to provide practical guidance to member states and other relevant stakeholders in developing measures aimed at combating hate crime in a comprehensive way in order to ensure effective protection against this phenomenon within the framework of human rights and the rule of law. Considering this comprehensive approach and the aim of effective protection against hate crime, the recommendation will have a strong emphasis on prevention and also on assistance to victims, including victims of homophobic and transphobic crimes. As for the definition of hate crime, the committee discussed many options and emphasized the need for coherence with already existing Council of Europe documents, like, for example, the recommendation on hate speech adopted by the Committee of Ministers in May this year. Following the discussions during the second meeting, for the purposes of the recommendation, hate crime is understood as a criminal offense committed with a hate element, which includes bias, prejudice, and/or contempt, and is directed against a person, group of persons, or property by reason of one or more real or attributed characteristics or status, such as race, color, language, religion, nationality, national or ethnic origin, age, disability, sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Hate is understood as including bias, prejudice, and/or contempt. This definition is still a work in progress, so it may be amended slightly in the upcoming meetings and exchanges between the meetings. However, I think it gives a good idea of the direction the committee would like to take, aiming at a comprehensive definition. The definition is complemented with suggestions for member states to address hate crime in legislation through different legislative models in order to ensure that all kinds of hate crimes are treated as such by criminal law. As you can see from this definition, the list of protected characteristics is not exhaustive, but is an open list with examples, and thus personal characteristics not explicitly mentioned can also be covered by the definition of hate crime in the national legislations. The list also includes the SOGIEC grounds. And as already mentioned, the work and the discussion on the definition of hate crime is an ongoing process, so nothing is yet set in stone. However, the list is the same as the one in the recommendation on hate speech. which the precise aim of keeping it concise and strict coherence with the recommendation is followed. Yeah, as I have mentioned already a few times, the Committee General strives to be consistent with existing international documents, in particular, of course, with those of the Council of Europe. In doing so, coherence with the recommendation number 5 of 2010 on measures to combat discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity is of our primary concern, especially the section 1 on hate crime and hate speech will, of course, also be taken into account. This is why the results of this thematic review process, which is culminating with this event of today, is of particular relevance for the work of the committee. Such results, including the good practices, will be made available to our participants and will provide precious information also for the explanatory memorandum, which will accompany the recommendation. In turn, we can also point out that, as it was the case with the recommendation on hate speech, the draft recommendation on combating hate crime will also be available for comments online and possibly through public consultations, which will be arranged after the third meeting. This third meeting will take place on 30th and 31st of March 2023. And in this context, civil society representatives will have the opportunity to comment on the chosen definition of hate crime. Yeah, I will now stop here and stand ready to reply to any questions you may have concerning the work and the progress of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I mean, it's very clear that there's a very important consultative process in place, including through the observers and with the openness then to review the draft definition. Also to stress what you mentioned about the importance of coherence, of course, within our own standards, while maintaining enough flexibility to be always inclusive of all grounds. Thinking right now, for example, of our other relevant work, which will concern intersex persons. So all these questions call for keeping the grounds always open. Now, speaking of coherence, I will turn to Tommaso Chiamparino, who's a policy officer in the Fundamental Rights Policy Unit at the European Commission within the Director General for Justice, also joining us online. Thank you very much for being here. So speaking of the importance of aligning our efforts in policy making, it's really a good chance here to hear from you and the ongoing work within the Commission, and perhaps particularly the initiative to expand the list of EU crimes to include hate speech and hate crime, and therefore how you are proceeding about it. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. It would have been very nice, but I'm kept here in my office in Brussels. Thanks for having me, and for I'm representing, as you said, the team in Directorate General for Justice that works on fundamental rights, and in particular the smaller team that deals with combating hate speech and hate crime. And so I'll outline briefly, as you said, to try to outline the EU perspective on how to address effectively hate crime and hate speech as experienced by LGBTIQ people and people perceived as such. And I'll focus on two layers. So to say, start with a sort of regulatory framework, legislation, and then a few mentions and references to the policy efforts that we're prompting. The first layer, regulation. So we have in place in the EU the 2008 framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia, which criminalizes hate speech and hate crime. It criminalizes the incitement to violence or hatred against persons or groups on the basis of protected characteristics of giving a definition of hate speech. And it establishes obligation to consider racist and xenophobic motives as aggravating circumstances of crime, sentencing of a crime, and thereby offering a definition of hate crime. However, the framework decision has a big limitation, and it has been stressed already. The limitation being, as everyone is aware, probably in the room, that it only covers racist and xenophobic grounds, resulting therefore incomplete and not offering the needed protection when hate crime and hate speech target gender identity, sexual orientation, sex characteristics, and gender expression. And we could also mention disability, misogyny, and other grounds of hatred that are not covered by the framework decision. That this has not prevented, luckily, I would say, some member states to go further than the framework decision in the transposition and covering also additional grounds. However, in light of the patchy legal framework that then affects EU member states in this respect, the Commission has initiated last December, has taken an initiative to prompt the Council to take a decision and extend the current list of EU crimes at Article 83 of the treaty to hate speech and hate crime. This list includes particularly serious crimes which have a cross-border dimension. You have in that list terrorism, child sexual abuse, and other very serious crimes with a cross-border dimension. The Commission thinks that hate speech and hate crime qualify for being part of that list, and therefore asked the Council to adopt a decision that would open that list and include hate speech and hate crime. If that happens, meaning a decision by the Council that has to be taken at unanimity, then the Commission would have the legal basis to act and propose secondary legislation that could complete the framework decision and extend it to other grounds than racism and xenophobia. State of play is that the ball is now in the Council, so with our member states, so we cannot stop but making a plea to colleagues from national authorities in the member states to quickly take a decision, an unanimous decision in that direction that would allow to have this important development. And currently, we're not yet there. We hope that there will be a decision in this direction soon. So that's as far as I can say on the legal framework. We are complementing that from the European Commission side with policy initiatives. So 2 years ago, the Commission has adopted the LGBTIQ equality strategies, which combine targeted actions with the mainstreaming of LGBTI equality in all policy areas, and commits the European Commission, member states, civil society organizations, and international organizations to take specific actions, including in the field of tackling anti-LGBTIQ hate crime and hate speech. There is a subgroup under the high-level group on equality and non-discrimination, facilitated by the Commission, specifically dealing with LGBTIQ equality, which represents, I think, for many of you, a known forum for exchange of good practices and guiding principles. The next meeting will be in few weeks, 14-15 November, and focus on legal gender recognition and participation of trans and intersex people in the labor market. In addition to that, let me also share the experience that we run on a daily basis, which is the one under the high-level group on combating hate speech and hate crime, which brings together national authorities, international organizations, some of which are sitting at the table there and have just spoken, Council of Europe and OSCE, ODIHR, and civil society organizations like ILGA Europe are member of this group, and the aim being to foster guidance, key guiding principles, and standards in the areas of hate crime reporting and data collection, hate crime training for law enforcement, hate crime victim support, and hate speech online. All areas where which are obviously interconnected. And if we heard the prestigious speakers that opened this event today, we could feel how important they are, in particular to address underreporting, to help the police offer a first line support to victims in a sensitive way, and to ensure adequate investigation and prosecution of cases. And this is what the high-level group aims to do and does by bringing together all these important players. And last point I'd like to stress, and I think it could be important for many of you in the room, is one of the main tools that we have is our funding. In the context of our priorities under the Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values program, there will be a specific line of funding to promote LGBTIQ equality, and that's in line with our past, in a way, the funding traditionally had such priority. But I'd like also to share with you that as from next year, 2023, and the annual work program is about to be adopted, there will also be a specific priority on combating hate speech and hate crime, open to civil society organizations and national authorities, and with an increased budget. So I'd invite everyone to stay tuned on the next calls for proposals that are due probably at the earliest in December 2022. We're also happy that through that work program will likely be able to support the SOGI unit for very important work and give it financial support that it deserves. Let me conclude. It was said already, but like in the description of the way the high-level group works, I think there's the essence of, in a way, the approach that we would like to have and we think is effective to have. I've spoken about European Commission initiative, but of course we're not alone here, and only a multi-layer and multi-institutional approach, so to say, can be effective. We've heard about the initiative by the Council of Europe on their recommendations on hate speech, and the upcoming one on hate crime. We'll hear very soon about what the OSCE ODIHR does in this field, and so this multi-agency approach is fundamental. I was pleased to hear that in the Parliament a debate was set last week on growing hate crime and hate speech against LGBTIQ people, and that led to a widely adopted resolution, which shows again how wide is the field, hopefully also in the political sphere, in support of these priorities. One very last point. We always say and tend to say civil society has a key role to play, and we insist on this in the context of the high-level group as well in our policy work. And one of the recent deliverables was a key guiding principles on cooperation between civil society and law enforcement. However, I think we should take this not just as empty words, because the risk is that we know what civil society can bring in terms of knowing the vulnerabilities, knowing the wounds that hatred generates into their communities, and how they can help authorities to understand and prosecute. But we should make sure that this is not an alibi for authorities or institutions to shy away from their responsibilities. Responsibilities cannot be delegated to civil society. So I think while it is always important to mention the cooperation between authorities and civil society, we should make sure that NGOs and organizations have the adequate resources that are needed to perform these activities on the ground and can operate in a safe environment and with the needed funds to do so. And we'll try to do our part with the funding program I mentioned before. I'll stop here, and I thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much for such a comprehensive presentation in a very short time, and for touching upon all the important issues, making my job much easier because you've basically introduced the relevance of the next presentations. But just to highlight indeed, thanks for bringing our collective attention to the necessity of resources to back up and sustain, make this work actually meaningful and actionable. Also for raising, which is extremely interesting for the rest of our conversation today, the transborder dimension as well of hate speech and hate crime. So this extension of the definition of the EU crimes as serious crimes is also really a very interesting angle for us. And for explaining all the work of the high-level group, of which, of course, our next speaker is also part of. So I will pass the floor to Viktor Kundrak, an international lawyer, but here speaking in his capacity as OSCE ODIHR's hate crime officer, and especially interesting for us in his role as responsible for ODIHR's hate crime report, which is published annually, and as such allows us to now open the question of the trends, which we know are not very encouraging, but and again underline the necessity for better policies. So please, Viktor, the floor is yours.
Do you hear me? Yes, is it working? Yes.
No, you should press.
Actually, it was pressed then. Okay,
Very good.
had been pressed. Thank you very much for the introduction, dear colleagues. It's my honor to speak here on behalf of ODIHR, and thank you to the Council of Europe and the Irish government for organizing this important event. I don't know if I can speak of trends. It's a difficult question. We can touch up on that during the question and answers parts. It's difficult to draw on trends from the data sets that we provide. But I'd like to stress the importance of this event and of the opportunity of gathering civil society, first of all, but also international organizations to speak about hate crimes, and especially anti-LGBTI hate crimes. And I would like to refer to what Michael Flaherty has already mentioned, the cold-blooded murder of 2 people in Bratislava.
Can you speak a bit more in the mic?
Okay.
Thank you.
Cold-blooded murder in Bratislava that happened a couple of days ago. It shows us that the topic or the theme of this event is highly topical: security and protection. So it's not just words. It's actually a very actual topic. The LGBTI people in far too many countries and regions and sub-regions are under daily threat of violence and As you probably know, the OSCE is the world's largest security organization, covering 57 states and a population of more than 500 million people. Through its three-dimensional approach to security, it has developed, under the human dimension pillar of its work, a very strong capacity in the area of hate crime. The OSCE participating states have agreed that hate crimes not only affect individual integrity, dignity, and the human rights of individuals, but they can also constitute security threat, a national security threat. And not just that. In 2009, all 57 participating states of the OSCE agreed on one single definition of hate crime, this being a criminal offense committed with a biased motivation. ODIHR has been mandated to serve the states as, among others, a collection point to gather hate crime information and data, which has allowed ODIHR to become, or to run, world's largest data set on hate crimes, so-called hate crime report, which is annually published on hatecrime.osce.org. And thank you to all contributors. I believe there might be some including the Irish government, of course, but for foremost civil society representatives that contribute to this very important data set. Last year, we celebrated 15 years anniversary of ODIHR's annual hate crime report. Through a series of other OSCE Ministerial Council decisions, which are politically binding standards, states have further committed to sending hate crime data annually to ODIHR. To that end, collect, maintain, and publish data at the national level, to adopt adequate legislation that allows for imposing appropriate sentences for hate crimes, to train their criminal justice officials, to provide support to victims of hate crime, or work closely with the civil society. ODIHR's role is to assist states in meeting these commitments, and we're doing so by offering a fivefold, if you will, comprehensive set of intervention areas. We provide legislative and policy advice. I'd like to advertise here a recently revised and republished Hate Crime Laws, a Practical Guide, which is one of our most favorite and cited publications. We provide comprehensive and tailored training programs for police through the TACKLE program, prosecutors and judges through the PACT program, and we train the civil society on hate crimes. We build capacity on recording and data collection for hate crimes through our INFACT program. Sorry for the acronyms. INFAHCT, if you will, program. We assist states in creating effective victim support structures for victims of hate crime through the toolbox developed under the recently wrapped up ESTAR project. And we create coordinating mechanisms through interagency protocols on hate crime. While hate crimes require a comprehensive response, states, those at least who wish to do better on hate crimes, sometimes struggle in understanding the multifaceted nature of the phenomenon. Now more than ever, all actors need to join all the forces in sending clear messages and speaking with one unambiguous voice. And ODIHR has put a lot of effort to ensure that we work together with other international partners, be it through joint diagnostic workshops on recording and data collection together with EU-FRA. We've conducted already 12 such diagnostic workshops in EU member states countries, which have led to providing sets of recommendations on recording and data collection to the relevant state authorities. We've collaborated closely with the European Commission, including through the EU high-level group against hate crimes and hate speech. And with the Council of Europe, we've worked closely with ECRI. We've coordinated closely with the HELP unit on training. We co-developed the hate crime and hate speech course in 2015 and updated it in 2019. And in the area of standard setting, we've worked closely on the recently adopted hate speech recommendation of the Committee of Ministers and the currently developing hate crime recommendations. Standards have been emerging also at the universal level. In March 2021, the Kyoto Declaration was adopted by the 14th United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. And its paragraph 91 asks UN member states to develop effective strategies, including by enhancing the capacity of criminal justice professionals to prevent, investigate, and prosecute hate crimes, as well as engage effectively with victims and victim communities to build public trust when engaging with law enforcement to report such crimes. And this is the first time such robust commitments have been put forward at the UN level. I would thus like to thank the Council of Europe for their efforts in joining forces, building on the strong case law of the European Court of Human Rights and a number of hard law and soft law international standards and good practices. The current work of the Committee of Ministers, Committee of Experts on hate crime recommendation is essential, as the future standard has a huge potential in enhancing states' understanding of hate crime and strengthening their response thereto, as well as preventing it. To date, a significant process has been achieved in states' understanding of the international concept of hate crime, the bias motivation being the agreed constitutive element of all hate crimes, which is the element that distinguishes hate crimes from other crimes, including namely hate speech. We wish that the new Council of Europe standard reads in an ambiguous language, is understandable to all national partners who have worked with commitment to address hate crimes across the region for many years now. Through our work, now moving to the sub-focus or the main focus of this roundtable, we've gained a decent understanding also of the situation of the LGBTI people across the region. The data collected from both government and civil society sources are worrisome, and especially the civil society figures show that in far too many states, LGBTI people face hate crimes on a daily basis. When it comes to state response, we have seen certain progress, but there is definitely a lot of room for improvement. Out of 57 states, only 33 have hate crime laws explicitly referring to sexual orientation, and 21 relating to gender identity. However, only 21 out of the 57 OSCE participating states record the SOGI category. And while laws matter, and the European Court of Human Rights has recently made it clear in the Oganazeva versus Armenia case, sometimes laws hinder the effective prosecution of hate crimes. We stress wherever we go, wherever we speak, that's why I'm doing it today as well, that recording bias motivation is where the energy should be put foremost. And recording not for the sake of just collecting data, but through the use of bias indicators, as Michael Flaherty has also mentioned, and adopting an effective monitoring definition. Recording helps identify victims and identify particular elements indispensable for effective investigation and prosecution of hate crimes. Once the victims of hate crimes are identified, they of course need to be provided adequate support and protection and assistance based on their individual needs. And it is great to see on the agenda of this roundtable that it strives to address all the different perspectives related to the hate crime phenomena, including on victim support. I guess my time was up. So I wish us a successful discussion, and I remain at your disposal if you have any questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And based on just echoing the last part of the many very relevant issues you touched upon, talking about recording and data collection as the basis also for policy making, but also to build the trust with the community, because this is our ability to recognize and record those bias indicators is what's going to actually enable and encourage to finally counter the underreporting that we know is going on as well. So the figures we have are also most likely not even the full picture. So last but not least, I'm so happy that Catherine Hugendubbel from ILGA Europe is with us, coordinator for the policy advocacy and strategic litigation of ILGA Europe. So I believe you certainly have also comments about what has been said, but from what my perspective, I think it's really important to hear from the perspective of the movement what this picture is. You have the map, of course, that I'm sure you will introduce, but that everybody's already highly familiar with, which indicates, well, not just trends, but also the response and the progress made within the member states. However, here we can also perhaps just raise the fact that it's one thing to have the legislation, it's another to implement it and to put it in practice and to actually measure the impact of it. So also perhaps interesting for us to hear what your expectations are for us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Evgenia, for introducing me, and thank you very much for the invitation, and to the Irish government and also the UK for supporting this event and bringing us all together. I think it was really important to hear all the commitments from everyone around the EU institutions, the agencies, the Council of Europe, different mechanisms, but I think also in the course of today of the member states on combating LGBTI-phobic hate crimes. So this is really great. Thank you. I was asked to, yes, give an insight on what the reality on the ground is like. And I think I don't want to go so much into the rainbow map because Victor just really set out quite nicely how many gaps we still have in actually naming sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sex characteristic in hate crime legislation. But yes, you can go to our rainbow map, which is online, and check exactly where different countries are standing. I want to more talk a little bit about what we've seen in our annual review, which is the other benchmarking exercise ILGA Europe is doing every year, and where we collect from activists, from LGBTI organizations in the ground across our region, so across Europe and Central Asia, on what's been actually going on over the last 12 months. So it's a bit the implementation piece of the legislation, the reality that people live. And whereas, yes, it might be a bit hard to identify trends, unfortunately, when we look at hate speech and hate crime, a quite clear trend has been emerging over the last years, and we saw it very clearly in our last annual review. Progress is not linear. Well, I think we can really see hate speech is on the rise, unfortunately, and that is online, and that is in real life for people. When we look at hate speech, I think there's three things I quickly want to mention. So on the one hand, what we've seen in our annual review 2021 report more clearly than ever is politicians, some government representatives, representatives of church leaders actually fueling hate. Again, the LGBTI community being part of a political game, being instrumentalized. We've seen that for other minority groups as well. Refugees and migrants have been actually, dragged into electoral campaigns. And this does have a negative effect on the community really clearly. So I think we need to be aware of that. In the annual review 2021, we've seen at least 22 countries across our region reporting hate speech in political debates and in electoral campaigns. And this is really a dangerous game that's been played. The other thing, if we look at that, is that we need to be really clear that unfortunately there are some actors, there are also some civil society actors that are actively steering hate and are actively trying to divide. On the one hand, even within the community, but also different minority groups. And this is again translating into really divisive hate. So we've seen it against the trans community recently. And I think, again, a lot of work has been going into actually looking at how these actors are interconnected. And we can all do more to actually counter their hateful narratives. The third I wanted to mention on hate speech is the really dangerous debates around education and some actors and some governments trying to limit sexual education in schools, education about diversity in sexual orientation and gender identity. Again, we clearly see a link between that and the hate that especially young LGBTI people are experiencing and the extreme harm that is doing on the community. So again, an area we might we used to look at education on one side and hate crimes on the other side, but we might need to start to think that more in combination and really see the links. As I said, this rise in hate speech is translating into a clear rise of anti-LGBTI hate crimes and violence reported in every country of our region. I just want to mention a few numbers, but really I'm not picking on different countries, but maybe because it's the countries we talk a little bit less about. In the 2021 report, we've seen a 39% of increase on LGBTI phobic hate in Germany, for example, and France introduced a new app to facilitate reporting, so a really good step forward. And in the first year, there were 4,000 incidences reported. So also maybe just to keep in mind, there is no East-West divide. This is actually a problem for all of us, and that's actually prevalent in every country in Europe. Also, domestic violence, again, a sector we sometimes see a bit apart from hate crime. but extremely on the rise during the pandemic and still ongoing. And I think again, here, we need to look at bias motivation as well. And I just want to name it very briefly. We're really talking about murders, we're talking about assaults, we're talking about corrective rapes, we're talking about anti-LGBTI police brutality, often not held accountable for. Someone referred to the really tragic killings in Slovakia. We've seen similar events in Oslo earlier this year. And just last week, we've seen a young gay couple in Armenia that took its life together. Now, you know, we can't go into the personal lives of people, but we do know that there's an extremely high prevalence of suicide and self-harm in the LGBTI community. So the link, I think, is pretty clear. I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, we come to data later, but what we've done at ILGA Europe is actually take the really wonderful FRA LGBTI survey, the second round, 2019 and 2020, and we've been digging a bit deeper and really tried to see in the different groups in the LGBTI community, because I think we often talk about hate crime and violence experienced in the community. And I think it's important to say that for lesbians, for trans and intersex people specifically, for young people, we have found clearly higher rates than the average for the LGBTI community. So I think it's worth really working individually. And I know Dan, for example, from OI Europe will speak later, but also others from TGU, from the ELC are in the room, to really look at what do targeted responses to specific people in the community actually look like. And we've seen higher prevalences if we look at the intersections of discrimination. So we've been looking at how do these rates actually change if we add disability to the numbers. And again, the figures have been going up quite clearly. Ethnic minorities, migrants, Roma, LGBTI people. So there's again, I'm happy to share the link to our website. There's a huge database now that can be used and should be used that we can look more closely. Before I come to what are the 5 things we'd like to put on the table for the discussion, I think some others have mentioned before. I just want to make 2 points. So on the one hand, yes, this is violence against people, and it's the right to life, it's the right to safety. It's not a added value to have. It's a very, very basic fundamental right to people. The second thing why it's so important that we're all discussing this is that because of the rise of hate speech and because of the rise of violence, we've seen progress stalling across the region. That means legal reforms have been stopped, have been halted. It means policies have been disrupted, but also services. And again, I think we need to really take that into consideration, especially for trans young people. It has been quite incredible to see that on the one hand, healthcare services through the official systems have been stopped because of hateful attacks, but also some NGOs actually having to stop their support services recently in the UK, for example, because of the hatred they were experiencing and the threats they saw. So it has a real impact, not only on the people's lives, but also on the protection that is being offered in this increasing difficult environment. So many people said already the first thing, of course, to look at is legislation. We do know there's draft legislation to fill those gaps on the table in some countries. I can mention Ukraine, Bulgaria, for example, but so many others. And I just want to insist once again on the real explicit mention on the list of grounds. So it's really important that we spell out sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, because we do know, especially where that's needed, so where the environment is more hateful, having those grounds explicitly mentioned in the law is not only helping us tackle the underreporting, is not only helping making the community feel safer because law has a normative function for society, but it's also helping the prosecutors to actually really follow through on the bias motivation. The second point is implementation, and we talked a lot about that as well. And I want to go here on the partnership with civil society, because so many people have mentioned that. And there are really good practices, and they're listed in the Council of Europe document as well. The one thing I want to say is really let's learn from the data dive that I've been mentioning. So let's also partner specifically with lesbian organizations, trans organizations, with organizations working on disability rights, for example. Let's really bring other partners into the mix to make sure the solutions are targeted to the community. On the other hand, and I think it was Tommaso from the European Commission who said it can't be a lip service, let's also be clear that all these organizations need to be resourced to do the important work they've been doing. We've been seeing a few, like the last 5 years, I think, have been wearing out the community in a way that we haven't seen before. Organizations have been stepping in, providing emergency support under the pandemic, have been stepping in, providing emergency support for refugees from Ukraine and the region. Like there is a real issue on how civil society is actually equipped and also supported in doing the important work they're doing in victim support services, but also in partnering with authorities in implementation. I already mentioned support services, so victim-centered support services are really important in that context to develop specialized victim support services and to actually do that in partnership with civil society organizations. Just 2 more words and then I'll finish. Training has been mentioned, and I think we know there's actually a very big catalog of good practice examples of trainings, but also of the, I think it's been mentioned by someone, the specific LGBTI contact people in police forces, and this has really meant an important step forward. We'd really like to add a focus on the judiciary in that conversation about trainings, because we do know that's more complicated. We do know that's where our members have trying to open doors, but it's very hard. And so I think if we could look more at that and what governments can also do, what institutions can do to bring those actors to the table, that would mean an extremely important step forward as well. And the last point was data collection, and it has been mentioned before. And I just want to say once again, like it's really important to include sex characteristics in that, because that's the ground that's still way too often falling off when we talk about data collection, but also, as I said, to really look at intersectional discrimination within the community, to really look, what does it mean if LGBTI people are disabled? How does their age, whether they are young or old actually as well, how does that translate into their experiences of hate, to get a more complete picture, and not to make it more complicated, but actually to allow ourselves to be even more targeted and even more effective in our responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think this is extremely helpful in the way you have laid out our mission here. I think it aligns also with a lot of the things that were already said. It seems we're all on the same page, and especially, well, of course, again, the issue of enabling the civil society to be a reliable partner and also to be the support system it is for the communities, as they do play a frontline role and should be resourced adequately, but also to bear in mind how we absolutely have to recognize the lived realities within the community, to not to break this one-size-fits-all or silo mentality, and therefore to work with the sub-identities, let's say. And of course, the intersectionality when it comes to other grounds, as disabilities and ages or ethnic and other backgrounds, again, for the sake of being efficient and not complicating our lives. This is to achieve results. So with this, I would like to open the floor. We're a little bit behind schedule. However, we will break a bit later. I think it's more important that we have time to speak rather than, and you will eat a bit faster, but you'll be fine. We'll still make sure that you have at least 1 hour. No one is going to be too pressed. But so we're pushing a little bit. I'm being told that we're breaking for lunch at 1:15, and we will have a little coffee break shortly as soon after these questions. So to make sure that we have all the time needed for our conversations. There's also a possibility for people online or for you to send us questions through the Slido, but also, of course, people in the room. If you have any questions for our panelists, now is your chance. And I'm
No?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Luna Laraliboni, Irish Council for Civil Liberties and coordinator of the Irish Coalition Against Hate Crime. Thanks a million. It's fantastic to be here. It's such a needed conversation. It's more a remark from a civil society perspective rather than a question, really. It's very welcome to all be here online, offline, talking about standards, because from a civil society perspective, whenever we approach legislation, implementation measures, it's really chaotic to navigate different standards, international, but also at the European level. We have the UN, we have the European Union, we have the Council of Europe, we have ODIHR. So just to stress how important it is that we try to align as much as possible when it comes to human rights standards, because it's such hate crime, legislating on hate crime, so especially when it comes to the criminalization bit, it's such a nuanced area of work that really what we need to be guided by is international and regional human rights standards. So civil society absolutely will always have, hopefully, a role, but we really need to convene as much as possible on definitions, on standards, whenever it comes to proving the different elements of the legislation, because I think that we can all agree that hate crime legislation is needed, for example, but if we start talking about the nitty-gritty of the legislation, we will probably start multiple conversations and realize that there are no standards in place. So just a remark on this, and thanks a million for organizing.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for that. I think, I mean, it is duly noted. It's not always easy, but I think the part of today's and the outcome of the report from the Council of Europe will be to sort of centralize as much as possible, and again, sort of meet this strike this balance between coherence, in enough rigidity to make it clear and from a legal point of view, but flexible enough to cover all needed grounds. So yes, thank you for that reminder, and I'm sure my colleagues take good note. And are there any other comments or questions you may wish to? Yes, thank you.
Yes, again, I just want to echo the remark there of Luna. Thank you. This is a very, very useful event. My own name is Adam Long, and I'm with the National LGBT Federation. So we would be one of the kind of the older LGBT plus NGOs in this space. So I have a comment and then just a question at the very end. So my comment is that I think it's very timely that today we're going to see the publication, as the Minister alluded to earlier, of the Hate Crime and the Updated Incitement to Hatred Act. That has been a huge pressing priority for the LGBT community. The National LGBT Federation back in 2016, we published a very comprehensive research into the views of our community kind of post the marriage equality referendum, and that showed that the number one issue in, you know, as far back as what 6-7 years ago was actually hate crime. So people, you know, it was a wonderful achievement to secure legal full equality in relationships, but still people were being attacked and are being attacked and harassed on the streets just for being who they are, just for their visibility. So it's great now to see finally, you know, after all the campaigning, what looks like a very comprehensive hate crime legislation. But of course, the key will be in the effective implementation of that law and the enforcement of that law. And certainly those of us in civil society will be watching that very closely. And then my second point would be in terms of the very welcome inclusion of hate crime and hate speech in the Commission's updating of serious crimes. I think that sends a very important and a very necessary signal. My question, though, is twofold. Am I correct in that that doesn't specifically include sexual orientation and gender identity across Europe? I just would like some clarification on that. And also in terms of it's, I suppose, kind of getting that consensus across Europe is tricky because there are certain countries, unfortunately, which are going on a path which are not LGBT plus inclusive within our own European Union. So I would just kind of like to know what the kind of mechanism of actually giving effect to that beyond the symbolic value, which is, and there is certainly symbolic value. Thank you.
I believe the first part of the question would go more to Tommaso. If you could hear the yes. Great.
Sure. Yeah, and thank you very much to both that intervened and made points on which I would like to quickly comment. Starting from the first comment made on the importance of standards, I just wanted to flag that I think we've reached the point where, at least from a EU perspective, we've been discussing a lot about indeed standards, guidance, what needs to be done, and good practices. And we now have the intention, and that will be launched very soon in the next couple of months, to go closer to the ground and help national authorities jointly with civil society to put the standards, mechanisms, definitions in place in their local context. And we'll do so by providing support to the organizations of events that could bring in at national level workshops and diagnostic workshops that could bring in experts from other international organizations or civil society or from other member states. So the idea is to cross-fertilize and go closer to the ground with bringing existing standards discussed always in EU fora or at least international fora, but now probably, as was mentioned by the first comment, in need of being more implemented on the ground. And I am also very pleased to hear from our perspective about the new hate crime legislation enacted in Ireland. It's a great step by the Irish authorities, and I hear that has happened exactly with that sort of process that was like inspired by having continuous exchanges with existing practices at other levels, by having the knowledge of experts coming from outside Ireland and from the international perspective brought in and contributing to the pathway towards the legal instrument. And then coming to the question on the EU crime extension initiative, as we call it, perhaps I went too fast and it was not clear, but actually it's a two-step process. So the first step, which is where we currently are, is that we need to include the reference to hate speech and hate crime generally as a specific type of crime in the list of EU crime in Article 83 of the treaty. And currently, as I mentioned during my presentation, you feature very serious crimes with a cross-border dimension, such as terrorism, for example, and you don't have a reference to hate speech and hate crime. We would like that reference to be there. And for that, we need the unanimity of all the member states. And you pointed out where the blockages can be, unfortunately, towards achieving that. Once and if this will happen, then the ball will be back to us, in a way, to the Commission, with its role of proposing legislation. And in that sense, we would be able to propose legislation at that point that could include additional grounds, existing ones covered by the framework decision, and so also covering gender identity, sexual orientation, and all other important grounds that would be emerging, that we know are there and would be emerging for the widest consultation that will obviously be done to launch any secondary legislation at a later stage. But I hope you understand that we're not yet there, unfortunately, and we are still aiming to have first the inclusion of a general reference to hate speech and hate crime in the list of EU crimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those clarifications. Was your second question? We have another, of course. But in the meantime, I wasn't sure if the second question was about the mechanisms outside the EU or no. Yes. So that was answered. Very good. Yes. Correct. Thank you. So we have another question from the room.
Hi, my name is Lorena Presada. I'm from Accept Association, the first LGBT organization created in Romania in the 90s when homosexuality was incriminated. Actually, Romania is one of the last countries, or the last country of the Council of Europe at the time to decriminalize homosexuality in 2001. I welcome this roundtable and all the conversations that we are having here. And I want to actually make a mention for future reference or for current reference in any report on hate crime. It's been said here that much of the hate crime is fueled by politicians. And we talk about standards in fighting hate crime. We talk about legislation. We talk about the lack of enforcement. But I think at the root of our efforts should be political engagement. And I want to highlight the need to engage with the political level in every country. I do not know what the situation is in each country, but I know that in Romania, the need to engage the political level on anything related to LGBT is paramount. We may have the most intense advocacy effort, or we may open to cooperation with police forces, but until there is no political will at the top of all these institutions, from the government to the members of the parliament, to actually adopt or improve legislation, to apply legislation, I think our efforts will continue to stall. Our progress will continue to stall. So I want to highlight the need to engage with the political level, even if it's in the context of similar events as this one, because we need to engage with them. We need to have the political level on board with us. Otherwise, yeah, they will be the ones fueling hate crime and hate speech.
Yes, indeed. Thanks a lot for this comment. And I will let Catherine add something, I believe, and then we will have to maybe take the last. Ooh, we have two questions. Okay, now I don't know what to do. We should. Okay, let's try. I'll ask you to be all as concise as possible, so that we can have a short break for coffee and then start at 2:15-ish sharp, if that exists, ish sharp, so that we can then have 1 hour of a panel and a lunch break. Catherine.
Okay, but very briefly, just on that, I think, yes, it's about, on the one hand, holding everyone accountable. On the other hand, it's really empowering each other and supporting each other in alliance building, and actually not only doing the right thing, but actually enabling others to be part of that conversation. And I just wanted to say, because before there was a focus on building support in societies and how societies are often not there yet. Yes, that's true. We need to invest in that as well. But I think we should also look very closely. I just want to mention Hungary is one example where often that argument is being made because there is a very hostile game being played. But actually, the surveys don't show that picture at all. Actually, over half of the Hungarian population do support same rights for the LGBTI community, do support partnership recognition. I don't know the exact figures, so I don't want to be quoted, but also a large proportion, for example, supports legal gender recognition. So I think we just need to be careful and look closely and use all these support rates as well to actually build the ground for legal change, because often it's the other way around as well.
Yes, indeed, and because I didn't respond, but yes, we are going to, of course, use these for as much as possible, because peer-to-peer is a very powerful tool as well. So hopefully this is one of these chances. So I had two interventions from the floor, please.
Paul Bloomer, Police Service of Northern Ireland. Catherine, you mentioned about groups and individuals who are pushing hateful narratives and indeed trying to even divide the LGBTI community. I mean, certainly in the UK, we've seen a massive increase in terms of output from gender critical movements. There, and I think it was the Independent Press Standards Organisation noted a 400% increase in reporting on trans issues in the UK media. And of course, with the recent hate crime figures that have been published, we've shown that there's a 56% increase in transphobic hate crime in England and Wales. So what I'm asking you is something that I'm personally struggling with, is how do we combat this, the anti-locution that's resulting in an increase in hate crime, while balancing the human rights of those expressing their freedom of expression? It's something that I am actually struggling with a little.
Do you want me to answer that in 1 minute before the coffee break? I think, no, just to say there's a lot of work and thinking in the community, and maybe we really, while grabbing a coffee, we can have a little bit chat, and I can tell you a little bit what we've been doing and where maybe we could work together more.
Yes, and I hope that these questions can also be explored further during, we have it's not over after this, huh? There's an entire afternoon of discussions that you will have plenty of space to, we're setting the scene. But yes, indeed, that's a very good question. And then we would have one final intervention for now.
Thank you. I'll be really quick. I was just interested, Catherine, in what you said about the link between education and education of children in schools, and the link between that and hate crime. And I suppose I'm old enough to remember the Exploring Masculinities pilot programme that was undertaken here in Ireland, and that became a target for conservative and I suppose right-wing actors here, and it was used to galvanise them and to really campaign against women's rights and reproductive rights. So is that what you mean? I'd just love to hear more about that and how we can guard against that or be alert to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. A topic for a 1 minute response. I actually already in my intervention cut out some figures I had on young people. And I think it's just striking to see now, annual review 2021, like 50% of students in Denmark. So I think, you know, in a very progressive, good legislation country, have suicidal thoughts or self-harmed from the community. It's a huge figure. 82% in Northern Ireland, actually, as we were talking about Northern Ireland. And I think, you know, all the limitations on, we're not talking about LGBTI people in schools anymore, because this is actually propaganda. This is actually setting a trend that all of a sudden everyone wants to be trans. Like all these rhetorics that we see going around are extremely harmful. And if these are starting to be taken on board in curricular choices, like if these kind of real attacks on the community are actually reflecting in the choices authorities make about what's being taught and what's not, we're reinforcing that circle of hate, and we're reinforcing, I think, the really high rates of being bullied in school, but also of, you know, members of the community themselves feeling that they don't have any space there, and you know, reinforcing the rates that are still extremely worrying that I've just mentioned. So that's the very short answer.
Thank you for keeping it concise and still highlighting those patterns and the vicious circles in which we are caught up with the hate speech, and also the way that opponents to human rights tend to intertwine education, rights of women, children's rights, etc., in counter narratives that we need to be hyper aware of. With this, I would like to invite you for a 10-minute coffee break. So you are back. Please be disciplined and be back seated at what is now I don't have the Irish time 12. So in 10 minutes at 12:22, and then we will be able to have 1 hour for the next panel. Thank you so much.
I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Kramer-Marsal, and I will be your moderator for this session. I am a human rights consultant helping the SOGIESC unit with a thematic review of the recommendation 2005. We shall now start with, actually we are not starting because we had already quite a bit of discussion already on advancing legal protection. So we'll continue speaking about legislation to combat anti-LGBT hate crimes, but of course with the understanding that this is the starting point and not the end point. You're all familiar with international standards, we've discussed that already, but at the national level, we know that legislation to tackle anti-LGBT hate crime varies greatly between countries. And you have even within countries for countries that have a decentralized form of government. So we have a lot of variation between defining what is hate crime, how it is addressed, the different models that exist, the protected characteristic. I think we went a bit through that. But I think we have also even though we have a patchwork, we have also good news in that we have quite a rich body now of research looking at how these hate crime laws function or fail to function. And I think that should be helpful to inform our member states on when they want to create or at least update their hate crime legislation. So we don't have much time, but in the 1 hour that we have ahead of us, we will not cover the complexity and the nitty-gritty details that were mentioned earlier, but maybe we can do 3 things. One is to ask ourselves the right questions. And I think we have Mark Walters, I'll introduce you fully later, to do that and to look at what the elements should be in hate crime legislation and what are the pros and cons on the legislative option chosen. So that's the first thing that we can do during this question, pose ourselves the right question. The second thing that we would like to do is to get updated and actually practical insight into the reform process that have been going on in different parts of the Council of Europe. And we are very happy to have with us 3 speakers that will bring a little bit, shed some light on the different experiences from Ireland, North Macedonia, and Latvia. And also, the third thing that we want to do in this session is to hear about the LGBTI people view on legislation and what their position is, how we can improve legal frameworks and make them more efficient, but also more inclusive. I think we had quite a bit of talks about that too. So we have 5 panelists with us today. We even added one chair because we have a lot to cover. And I would like to introduce our first speaker right away. This is Mark Walters sitting next to me. And Mark, you've been focusing a lot on criminalization of hate crime offenses. And your research has informed the drafting of bills in different places. So you have also a very practical insights on how this is working. And we're very glad that you have taken on the challenge, really the challenge, to navigate us through the different approaches in the next 7 minutes. So I'll give you the floor right now, and you will be using a PowerPoint presentation so that everybody can follow.
Yeah. I realize I'm not giving a keynote, but as a university lecturer, I can't bear to sit down and present, so I thought I'll stand up here. It's also really nice to be invited to an event with the word Europe in, which hasn't happened for at least a few years for me. So that's also quite delightful as a British person. So over the next 6.5 minutes now, I'm going to outline some of the different types and models of hate crime law that are being used throughout Europe and globally, and some of the sort of key pros and limitations of those different approaches, and a few recommendations based on my research, which is presented in a new book that came out on Sunday, actually, Retailing in Awe, mainstream outlets called Criminalizing Hate by Palgrave. So first of all then, here's a map of all of the jurisdictions globally that we identified as criminalizing hate-based conduct. And you can see there, Europe, there's a slight outlier, the little grey areas, Estonia, but also Ireland. And as of today, I'll have to change that map. And it will become light blue, because the light blue countries are those countries where there is a hate crime bill, which may or may not be enacted. So I'll have to spend probably about 25 minutes trying to work out how to change the map. So thank you very much, but that will be changed later. But what you'll see here is over 190 jurisdictions globally that criminalize hate. Huge difference over the last 20 years or so. 74 of those jurisdictions cover sexual orientation, and 38 specifically cover gender identity or transgender. Now, within Europe, 37 European states cover sexual orientation, 18 cover gender identity or transgender, and 1 covers sex characteristics. Of course, sex and gender may also include those different characteristics, but specifically those words, gender identity or sex characteristics, are included in only 19 jurisdictions. What's key, what I really want to impress upon you all through this presentation is that including sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics in legislation is only part of a very complex puzzle. It is incredibly important that the right types and models and legal tests are used within legislation so that you don't have statutes that protect gender identity or sexual orientation, which just remain on the statute books and are never applied in practice. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of technical law. I won't do too much. I don't want to send everyone to sleep, but just to go through the different types and what I would recommend as the types of legislation that ought to be used in any given jurisdiction, regardless really of its legal system. So you have to start off by looking at the type, then the model within the legislation, choose a legal test, choose how you prescribe what we refer to as the hate element, and then define what victim groups you want to protect. So first of all, what types of hate crime laws are there across Europe? Well, there are 2 main types. The first is substantive offences. Now, these are hate crime offences which are within the criminal law. Yeah, that means that a specific criminal offence has been included in law. That might be, for example, in France, acts of violence committed because of the sex or sexual orientation of the actual supposed gender identity of the victim. That is a specific offence in law. Yeah, that means that a hate crime can be committed and you can be prosecuted, convicted, and if you are convicted, it will be on your criminal record that you have committed a hate crime offence. Yeah. The other main type is called sentence uplift, sometimes referred to as penalty enhancements. Now, these often operationalize at the end of the criminal process. So an individual won't be prosecuted with a specific hate crime offence, such as sexual orientation, aggravated assault. They won't be prosecuted with that. They will be prosecuted with assault. But right at the very end of the process, if they're convicted of that basic offence, the judge can say, oh, there's some evidence here of hostility or animus or prejudice, and I will enhance the penalty. Yeah. And then finally, there is what's called a hybrid approach, where any criminal offence can be aggravated in law and a penalty enhancement can be applied. That's quite complex, and I'm not going to go through the details of that, but that's the approach that's used in Scotland and many of the states in the United States of America. Okay, that's called parasitical liability, where any crime on the statute book can be aggravated and prosecuted in a court. Okay. So having examined these different types within Europe and globally, I would say that it's important that a jurisdiction enacts a substantive offence or a hybrid approach. That means that hate crimes are found within the criminal law. The importance of that is that you have in law hate crimes labelled. People will be prosecuted with a hate crime. And that means that the hate element has to be proved as a substantive component of the criminal offence. Yeah? That comes with due process rights as well. You can defend against that. What happens if you use the sentence uplift approach is that many hate crimes just fall out of the system. They drop out. Why? Because the police and prosecutors don't have to provide evidence of the hate element to get a conviction. So it often drops out of the system. And we know through our analysis that jurisdictions that rely solely on this sentence uplift approach, those hate crime provisions are more rarely applied in practice. Okay. You then have to choose the model. I don't have time to go through the different types of model, but what I do want to emphasize is that those that use what's called the animus model, where you have within the legislation some form of, for example, hate motivation, that there are real difficulties in jurisdictions that rely solely on a motivation test. Now, that's not to say that having a motivation test isn't important, and it is usable. What we found when we were researching this, Jennifer and I, in a life cycle study across various different EU jurisdictions, was that quite often, where the jurisdictions rely just on a test which says you have been motivated by prejudice or hate, that's very, very difficult to prove practically, okay? And so we found from each of our national reports that the key limitation of the application of hate crime legislation is motivation, okay? So if you are going to use a motivation test, I suggest that you couple it with a second test, either a demonstration test or with what's called a by reason test as well. I know that probably some of that might go over some people's heads. It's technical law. I can talk a little bit more about it in the discussion. So a motivation test can be applied, but in practice, it is a real limiting factor on the application of hate crime legislation. Okay, then just very finally, because I know I've probably run out of time already, have I? Yeah, okay. So very quickly then, you have to decide what word you're going to use to describe the hate element. You can see all the countries I've listed there for hostility. Some use prejudice, some use intolerance, some use contempt, some use malice and ill will. I would say that you ought to use a mix of those. Hostility, prejudice, and contempt are probably the mix that you can combine. That will encompass more different types of hate and the types of animus which underpin different criminal offences. If you just use one, it narrows the types of cases that can be prosecuted in practice. Okay, and I can give specific examples of that in just a moment. And then finally, my recommendation is that you include definitions of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics within any given legislation. Those are the definitions that I've used in the bill that I draft for Seychelles. It ought to be inclusive and non-technical so that it can be interpreted in a broad way. If you don't use definitions, then it will be for the court to determine. And courts can often define these types of characteristics very narrowly indeed. So I know that was a real rush. I will stop there. Sorry if I've gone over, but happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your for being so concise. I think the screen with the time just fell as a sign. But thank you very much for giving us a bit of a reference frame for our discussion, because I think we'll come back to it. There may be some technicalities that are difficult to digest, but what I suggest we do now is to look at the practice, and there was a bit of a momentum created this morning also with the bill that was adopted here in Ireland. And I would like now to pass the floor to Lisa Doherty from the Ministry of Justice, to tell us a little bit more about the process and indeed the content of this bill, keeping in mind what we've heard so far. Lisa, you have the floor.
I might not have, that's working. I feel like I should rewrite my notes after Mark's words to tee up more directly with the various delineations. It is a real pleasure to be here today. The timing just couldn't be better. Really, we didn't plan this, although it might look like it. And as the Minister said, we're delighted to have had approval of the new hate crime and hate speech legislation on Tuesday this week. The bill will be published in the coming hours, and I'm sure there's great interest in taking a closer look at it. Getting to this point has not been easy, but it is, of course, hugely significant and has been a key priority for my minister, the Minister for Justice, for a number of years. So I thought in the few minutes available, I'd give a quick overview of the legislative framework that we opted for in Ireland. I know there will be others, and talk you through some of the key provisions, but also the explicit references as we have in our bill, which is called the Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offences Bill 2022. It does explicitly include sexual orientation, sex characteristics, gender identity, and gender expression as protected characteristics. And I'm happy to provide any further details afterwards if anyone has questions. So, as Minister O'Gorman said earlier, the need for new progressive hate crime legislation and updated hate speech laws has been very widely accepted in Irish society. We've seen horrific attacks earlier this year, in particular against members of the LGBTI+ community, and they cause genuine revulsion amongst the public. The government has been very firm that this type of violence is inexcusable and further marginalises the most vulnerable and minority groups, and made clear that we will not stand for this type of behaviour, that it's not acceptable, and that there will be serious consequences for these actions. The model we opted for is that we have a bill that covers both hate speech and hate crime in the one piece, but on the basis of the same protected characteristics. And these provisions have been very carefully developed to ensure that it is victim-centred and effective in securing convictions where serious crimes are committed. The protected characteristics, maybe to list them all, that's underpinning the new law are race, colour, nationality, religion, ethnic or national origin, descent, sexual orientation, sex characteristics, gender, including gender expression or gender identity, and disability. And these have been very carefully defined, and I totally agree the definitions are so important, either in line with international best practice or cross-referencing other legislation in Ireland, our equality acts. I'm very proud that Ireland has encompassed all of the SOGIESC characteristics. The addition of sex characteristics is quite recent, and that came on the back of recommendations from a number of stakeholders, including LGBTI+ civil society organisations. Gender had been there and is defined as expressly including gender expression or gender identity. We had a 1989 Act that didn't include gender or disability, and it was really important that they were there and fully defined. As I mentioned, the legislative framework provides for both hate speech and hate crime on the basis of these protected characteristics in the one piece of legislation. In relation to incitement to violence or hatred or hate speech, the new law repeals, replaces and simplifies the provisions of a 1989 Act I mentioned, which, while in some respects was ahead of its time 30 years ago, it was unfortunately very ineffective in securing any prosecutions, only about 50 in 30 years, which is really quite astounding. So this new legislation, with that in mind, has been designed to make sure it is more effective. And by doing so, it will criminalise any intentional or reckless communication or behaviour that's likely to incite violence or hatred against a person or persons because they're associated with the protected characteristics. It also reflects the current context more accurately, including online hateful content. The bill also legislates for hate crime for the very first time in Irish law. This is being done by creating new aggravated forms of certain existing criminal offences where those offences are motivated by hatred. Specific aggravated offences are incorporated into the law, which represent the types of offence most commonly manifested as hate crimes in Ireland, for example, assault and criminal damage. When one of those offences is committed and the perpetrator either demonstrates hatred of a protected characteristic while committing the offence or is motivated by hatred, that will be a hate crime. So in answer to Mark's question, we are adopting the dual approach. This legislative approach was agreed on the basis of considerable research and consultation, and we believe will ensure that convictions are secured. While the offences listed, such as assault and criminal damage, are already crimes, the hate element will lead to a higher penalty and will be recorded as a hate crime. For any other offence not specifically listed in the law, a judge will be able to hand down a higher sentence if there is evidence that there was a hate element to the crime, that it was an aggravating factor. So these provisions, we believe, will ensure that when an individual commits a hate crime, it will be labelled as such and will appear this way on their criminal record. This will allow for better data collection. It gives additional information to the prisons and probation service, which may be useful in the management of offenders, and we hope to deter these crimes. The new law fully aligns with relevant EU directives and strikes a careful balance with protecting the right to freedom of expression we heard a lot about earlier, in line with ECHR. We do recognise, of course, that certain elements will need to be further refined and amended in due course in the future, but we can stand over the fact that the legislation was informed by a very extensive public consultation process that started a number of years ago, and the views and lived experiences of key stakeholders, including from the LGBTI+ community. The government was very committed to getting this legislation right. It's taken a long time, but that was important to do that. Inputs were welcomed at all stages from stakeholders from the initial public consultation in 2019 up until the final drafting of the bill in the recent weeks and months. It is minority and vulnerable communities most targeted, and therefore it was a very important responsibility to ensure their voices were heard throughout this process and their concerns and experiences addressed and reflected in the legislation where possible. We also worked very closely with An Garda Síochána, delighted that they're here today, that's the Irish Police Force, and with the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General's Office. The Minister for Justice, Helen McAtee, will introduce the bill to Parliament in the coming weeks. We're on a very quick path to try and get it to enactment before the end of the year. And I'm very happy to answer questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for highlighting some of the key features of both the process, the consultation, and the model that was chosen. You mentioned also sex characteristics are explicitly included and defined. We'll come back to that, I think, in the discussion later on and also in the presentation. But without further ado, I think we would like now to zoom in on another part of Europe, in North Macedonia, where Besa Harifi, who is teaching criminal law at the Southern European University in Tetovo, you will be presenting a little bit the effort that have been made in North Macedonia, because you've been sitting in a working group that looks at amendments. So maybe you want to share a little bit your experience with that.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, you can hear me, right? And thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel, which I consider to be a very important one. And I hope that we all get to important recommendations that will be implemented in practice in the states of the Council of Europe. So it is my privilege to be here today, and I will talk about some initiatives that have been going on in North Macedonia regarding hate crimes. First of all, I would like to state that hate crime legislation has been introduced in North Macedonia Macedonia from 2009. But at that time, when we talk about the protected characteristic of sexual orientation, it was not mentioned as such a characteristic. It was included in the marginalized group, like a bigger group that also included the sexual orientation and gender identity. But with the initiative of the OSCE mission to Skopje, which I would say is a pioneer and the most important international organization working on hate crimes in Republic of North Macedonia, a working group was created, as it was mentioned by the moderator. And this group included people from the academia, from practitioners, and from the civil society organizations. And they drafted the amendments of the criminal code, which entered into force in 2018. Of course, there was a very big struggle to actually establish a reporting mechanism for hate crimes, and we still struggle with the official reporting of this kind of crimes. But again, the CSOs and the OSCE mission here has helped a lot into establishing these kind of mechanisms. And I would like to mention here the hate crime website, which is run by a local NGO at North Macedonia, the Helsinki Committee for Human Rights, and it was established as a project with the OSCE mission there. And that website has the most accurate data on hate crime incidents regarding in North Macedonia. Also, there has been a hate crime victimization survey in North Macedonia, recently also published, but it was published as an academic study, and there is still not a mechanism to include victimization surveys into reporting hate crimes in North Macedonia. Also, in present times, the police has established a reporting mechanism. However, there is this reporting mechanism, as I will show in the future slides, in the next slides, is very limited and does not cover all the bases and all the incidents that are identified by CSOs in Macedonia. Just a quick say what the group did. We, as a working group on drafting the amendments on hate crimes, did a comparative analysis of hate crimes throughout Europe, did a study visit in Zagreb, and we prepared actually the draft amendments that were later adopted in the parliament and now are part of the criminal code of Republic of North Macedonia. To refer what the previous speaker said about the ways how you incriminate hate crimes in North Macedonia, we incriminate hate crimes in our criminal code, firstly, by defining them in the general article 122, where we define all the terms that are mentioned in the criminal code, and there the hate crimes are defined as crimes with biased motives, and the biased motives and the protected characteristic includes sexual orientation now and gender identity. Unfortunately, it still does not include the sex characteristics, but that is again a good thing that sexual orientation and gender identity are included as protected characteristics. Another important article is Article 39, which indicates that the biased motivation as an aggravating circumstance of any crime is obligatory for the court to justify the decision if they have decided not to refer to the biased motivation as an element of the respective crime, which says that every crime can be a hate crime when there is a biased motivation, and the judge is obliged to actually take that into consideration while preparing the verdict. In the special part of our criminal code, there are actually 26 substantive criminal acts that can be referred to as hate crimes, and which are actually qualified versions of the ordinary crimes in different chapters of the criminal code. I will not go into them in particular, but they cover a wide range of crimes, of assault, violent crimes, crimes against property, etc. While preparing the amendments, we took into regard the recommendations of the OSCE ODIHR, which actually looked into the amendments and had some specific remarks that were included in the draft amendments after it. So the obligation to specify for the judge that a crime is committed as a hate crime was introduced in our hate crime legislation. The OSCE ODIHR was a bit skeptical in regard to the political affiliation as a protected characteristic, but in North Macedonia this is quite a great issue because the second biggest group of hate crime incidents committed is that of political affiliation. So we left that characteristic, although the OSCE ODIHR said that it is not a very it should not be there at the criminal code, but however we felt that it is a very specific one for North Macedonia. Also OSCE ODIHR had other recommendations in regard to desegregation of official data regarding the victims of hate crimes, and encouraged the successful investigation to be a part of changing, how to say, the criminal justice system and the mentality regarding these hate crimes. We might have a very good legislation when it comes to hate crimes. It's really specific. It covers all the bias. Of course, it still needs to, it can even be done better. But however, the biggest problem that North Macedonia has in this regard is about implementation of this very good legislation, as I said. And this is noted in the EU progress reports on North Macedonia. I've put here remarks from both reports, from last year's and from this year's, because they tend to emphasize the lack of court practice in regard to implementation of these legal provisions in practice. And I will just leave these remarks here just for you to have a look at, because it's actually something that the European Union actually emphasizes in every report, that there is still not being done much to implement these provisions in practice. To illustrate that, I've added some data from the websites that are available in North Macedonia, and these are the official reports of the OSCE hate crime website. When it comes to Macedonia, you will see that there are actually reportings in police, but there are no cases of prosecution and court verdicts regarding those reportings. So there is a specific reporting mechanisms in police, but still there are no prosecutions and court verdicts in regard to hate crimes. All these crimes, it does not mean that they are not prosecuted, but they are prosecuted as ordinary crimes, not as hate crimes, which is not the idea why these provisions exist. Also, when it comes to the reporting mechanism in our police, you will see that most of the reports are regarding to the bias motivation of ethnicity. Okay, and the police has no official records for sexual orientation as a bias in hate crime incidents, which goes in contrary with what the data from CSOs says, because, for example, the CSO have identified many more incidents in regard to the police. And these incidents are covered for the period of 2013 up to 2022. And we will see that there is a number of hate crimes based on sexual orientation and gender identity, 24 in all during this time period. You will see that the number is rather low in regard to other hate crimes, where ethnic origin is the most, represented hate crime, and also political affiliation. But again, there is data that also hate crimes regarding sexual orientation are very present in the society. This is a map where you can see the places of Macedonia where hate crime incidents occur. This is about all categories. You will see that, as I said, most of them cover the ethnic incidents, also the political affiliation. And these are the only hate crime incidents in regard to sexual orientation that are identified by the CSO mechanism in this regard, which tells us that these kind of crimes are underreported in North Macedonia. And there are many reasons for that. First of all, there is a lot of stereotype and prejudice, and also another fact that I would like to mention: in North Macedonia, all polls show that people have very low trust in judiciary system, and that's why maybe that also contributes to underreporting of hate crimes regarding sexual orientation. I will end with a key observation in regard to hate crimes in North Macedonia, which recognizes the efforts of North Macedonia to actually establish a comprehensive and inclusive legislation in regard to hate crimes, but it also refers to the lack of implementation of these provisions in practice. And I will conclude with only 4 findings. I think it's very important that the official reporting on hate crimes is accurate, closer to the data received by CSOs, not to have such a big gap between what is officially reported and what is reported by CSOs. The public law prosecutors have undergone many trainings with the help of OSCE ODIHR, but still they lack, I don't know, if it is the courage or the initiative or just the overall, they don't have this will to prosecute these crimes as such, although they have the legal basis to do so. So thus, in my opinion, it's really unacceptable that having some legislation on hate crimes from 2009 to now to not have one single court verdict in regard to hate crimes is really unacceptable for a country of Council of Europe. And we tend to ignore these kind of crimes in our societies, but that doesn't make them disappear. It creates marginalized communities, and it is a source, a root for other problems in society. So I will leave it there, and yeah, maybe we'll continue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Besa. I think you have already posed one possible question of, good laws with a lot of international help, namely OSCE ODIHR, but lack of implementation, basically. That's not. But so this is also something I think we would like to certainly discuss later on. But before we do that, we have 2 more speakers, and we would now like to zoom in into the situation of Latvia with, and we're very pleased that we have with us Mrs. Golubeva, who has been very committed to passing hate crime legislation when she was Minister of Justice. I think it was of Interior, sorry, Minister of the Interior, and but I think it was a rocky road. So you'll tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, yes, now it is. Yes, thank you very much. Well, I cannot say that in Latvia the legislation is completely ignoring a hate crime against LGBTI, but on the other hand, it is very far from perfect. So the criminal law in Latvia distinguishes between several types of hate crimes. One is incitement to social hatred, and some biases are mentioned, but others are not. For example, gender, age, health, and any other distinction is mentioned. There is also a different type of crime, which are actions that are directed at inciting racial, ethnic, or national hatred. So basically, some types of bias are singled out as, in a way, more important than other types of bias. For both of these crime types, crimes committed using internet are supposed to be classified as more grave than those that are not. Discrimination itself is, of course, also classified as a crime. However, again, only certain types of bias are explicitly mentioned, and that is racial and national bias, and other are mentioned just as other biases. Crimes which are perpetrated systematically against a group of persons based on political, racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, or gender criteria, or other criteria in international law, are classified as crimes against humanity. And finally, racist or ethnic motives and religious motives, as well as unspecified social bias, are defined as aggravating circumstances for any crime. So I suppose that would be a hybrid system, according to the first speaker's classification. But what we can see here is that gender identity and sexual orientation are definitely not seen as important as some other biases. And that is, of course, not the way it should be. So there have been, of course, attempts to amend this legislation, not least in the current outgoing parliament, but they never gathered majority support, so they were never passed. And under these circumstances, of course, it is particularly important that practical work, when police and prosecutors are working to prosecute hate crimes, that practical work actually tries to accomplish what legislation does not. Because, of course, there is basis in law for prosecuting crimes against LGBTI, mentioning them as social group or social bias, but the police needs to know that, and the police needs to be enabled to do that. And with that purpose, there has been a working group at the Ministry of Interior last year, which basically produced a number of recommendations on how police work could be improved. They, of course, also produced recommendations for legislation, but those were not very successful, so to say. So some changes that have happened is that IT system for registering incidents in the police now enables to tick a box that an incident might be a hate crime. We didn't have that before. There are improvements to the way incidents are registered to enable statistics about hate crimes, including which bias, or which criterion of discrimination or hatred was involved. This is, however, not fully implemented yet. The law on police, we had a proposal after this working group that the law on police should include a non-discrimination clause, which it didn't. And I proposed that as minister to the parliament. Unfortunately, the parliament didn't approve that. However, some other things were done. The already existing training for police officers on hate crimes, which was developed previously as part of EU project, had been reintroduced as one of the priority trainings for police. And also the approach that in every region of the country, there should be some policemen trained on hate crime has also been adopted. So hopefully within another year, we will have in each region of the country several, or at least one or two police officers who can help their colleagues how to investigate hate crime. And the newly formed cyber police, which has only been formed basically last in this year, also includes hate crime as one of their priorities, so a hate crime on the internet. What this all means in practice is as yet a little bit too early to evaluate. Just before this roundtable, I requested statistics on prosecuted hate crimes to make sure that I understand the trends correctly. And unfortunately, I do. The crimes which are specified as specific bias, which is somewhat privileged, which means racial, ethnic, and national background, are the ones which are prosecuted much more frequently, and other hate crimes are prosecuted very seldom. So that basically indicates that what you kind of encode in your laws, you also get as the output, as a result in the whole system of law enforcement. There are, however, some good news. The University of Latvia, in cooperation with State Police and Prosecutor's Office, is currently implementing an EU project on hate and bias, which explicitly mentions bias against LGBTI. There are guidelines for police, which have been updated in 2021 on hate crime investigation, and they also mention explicitly examples on hate against LGBTI as a bias. So there are some practical tools that police can work with, but as we can see from the statistics, the absence of such crimes as explicitly named crimes in the legislation maybe has a negative effect on prosecution. So the main takeaway from this, I imagine, for other countries is that, well, what the colleague from Romania during the previous questions and answers session mentioned, it's very important that there is political commitment to persecuting hate crimes and also crimes based on bias against gender identity and sexual orientation. And when this is not the case, with practical instruments which the executive branch of government has, you may not be enough to achieve an improvement in how such crimes are tackled. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this overview, and to highlight also that despite the lack of legislative advances, there are some practical elements that have been taken on board, like to make some progress, but you also raised some interesting question on whether the law is creating a sort of a hierarchy of hate crime victims. And I think that's also something that could be interesting for us to discuss. But we have also with us Dan Christian Gattas, who's Executive Director for OI. And I think that you've been very much advocating for some changes in legislation and indeed to include sexual characteristics. And I think you will tell us a little bit more about the argument for it. And so you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Also, thank you very much for inviting OI Europe to this really important and timely roundtable. Timely because hate speech and hate crime against intersex people is on the rise against persons and organizations when it comes to hate speech. Our national organizations, some of them have conducted research, and it shows clearly that action is needed. We all know that the increase of hate speech also sets the ground for an increase of hate crime. And currently, and I was going to say 6, but I'm very, very glad that I can now say 7 Council of Europe member states have hate speech, hate crime legislation in place, which includes the ground of sex characteristics. But existing research and reports submitted to OI Europe show that intersex people all across Europe experience hate crimes on a regular basis. And this includes physical and psychological intimidation, aggression and violence, physical or sexual assault, including rape, and verbal assault on the grounds of being intersex. And like ILGA Europe, OI Europe deep dived into the 2019 FRA survey data explorer, and this gave us an idea of the very varying scale of these incidents. And just let me present a few figures to you. In the 5 years before the survey, 22% of intersex respondents experienced a physical and/or sexual attack for being intersex. And this makes intersex persons the most affected group among LGBTI people in that survey. Almost 40% of intersex respondents experienced violent in-person threats to being intersex in the 12 months before the survey at least once, and 27 experienced that 6 or more times. And this means that among all LGBTI respondents, intersex persons experienced the second highest rate, 42% of harassment for being intersex in the year, for being LGBTI in the year before the survey. We also found that intersex respondents are the ones with the highest rates for often or always avoiding certain locations, over 40%. And the negative impact of these incidents on the individual is severe. When intersex respondents were asked about how the last hate-motivated violence incident affected their health and well-being, 59% stated that they were afraid to go out or visit places. 56% said that they had psychological problems, including depression or anxiety, and 9 had actually to go to the hospital to seek medical assistance. And I don't put these figures forward to create a hierarchy, but I put them forward because intersex people are still very invisible when it comes to being victims of hate crime and hate speech. And the data gets even more worrying when we look at the situation of young people. 14% of the young respondents aged 15 to 17 stated that they suffered from physical or sexual attacks due to being intersex in the 12 months before the survey. And this again means that they experienced incidents that meet the criteria of a criminal offense and of bias motivation, and the majority of them experienced this in an educational setting. And last but not least, reports of intersex persons submitted to OI Europe show that violence towards intersex persons is also very common in family settings. And we have the high number of intersex persons experiencing homelessness in the FRA survey, 29%. And half of those who had experienced or are experiencing homelessness stated that violence in the family on the grounds of their sex characteristics, on the grounds of them being intersex, was a reason for their homelessness. And we also know that, for example, for the Council of Europe region, ECRI issued several recommendations on intersex in the past 3 years, and including the strong recommendation to incorporate the protection of intersex persons on the ground of sex characteristics in member states' anti-discrimination, hate speech, and hate crime legislation. But still, when intersex NGOs advocate for the inclusion of the ground of sex characteristics in hate crime legislation, they often face reluctance. They face arguments like, wouldn't it be just enough to have intersex persons covered under one of the other grounds, for example, gender identity, or maybe gender expression? Or aren't intersex people already covered by sex and or gender? So what does it actually mean to be attacked for being intersex? And I would like to invite you to use your imagination. I am giving a small trigger warning, but I won't go into too many details. But I want really to bring the point across. Please imagine a person standing at a crossroad. She's standing completely still, waiting for the lines to turn green. The person was assigned female at birth, raised as a girl, and identifies as a woman. Her body, however, does not fit the norm. While she is of what is considered average height for a female assigned person, her facial features and her stature are not aligned with the female norm, whatever that means, but in the eyes of the perpetrators. And she has heard a lot of derogatory language targeting her secondary sex characteristics already as a child and adolescent. Suddenly, a group of people appear. Once they see her, they start laughing and calling her names, referring to her secondary sex characteristics, to her facial hair, to her stature. They call her a freak of nature. And then this hate speech turns into a hate crime, and I will end there. This is a hate crime on the grounds of the physical appearance of the person, of sex characteristics that do not fit the norm. And while the protection on the grounds of SOGI and gender expression can include some aspects of physical appearance, they also include actual or perceived behavior, actual or perceived expression of a person's gender. An intersex phobic attack, however, focuses mainly on the person's sex characteristics. And perpetrators, and we know that from reports, perpetrators, especially those who profile their potential victims, often can sense that the intersex person never had a body that conformed with the norm at any point in their life, and that they are therefore vulnerable because they've never been protected and never felt that they were protected. And as for the intersex person, in regards to reporting, monitoring, or prosecution, the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, or even gender expression require to cross a difficult mental gap, as the violence and harassment that they experience and have experienced from an early age on has always been centered around their physical appearance. That is either the primary or secondary sex characteristics or both. So regardless, and this is regardless of whether or not the intersex person was subjected to invasive surgery and other medical treatment. So what does this mean? This means that the lack of an explicit protective ground adds to shame, taboo, and silencing, which make it often impossible for the intersex individual to understand that they had become victim of a bias-motivated crime. Especially as this bias arises from the prejudice, still very much entrenched in society, that a body with a variation of sex characteristics is less valuable. An intersex victim of such a crime will therefore almost never report those incidences to the police or another authority out of the very real fear that is based on very real experience that they will encounter the same disbelief, neglect, ridiculing, or invasive curiosity about their body that they are used to encounter in society. And this, of course, gets aggravated by interventions like harmful medical practices like IGM or other harmful practices. So without a ground that encapsulates the specific experience of intersex persons with living with a non-normative body in society from the moment they were born, without the protective ground of sex characteristics, bias-motivated intersex-phobic hate crimes will continue to happen unnoticed, unmonitored, and without being prosecuted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to confront us with the experience of intersex persons and to analyze also the consequences of excluding intersex from or sexual characteristic into the law. That is very important. You've made a very strong case. And I think that it's good that we open for discussion. I think technically we are, of course, way after time, but I think it is logical. We have a number of very interesting interventions, and we want to give space for people to ask questions. So I would ask anybody to raise their hand, present themselves, and ask their question. We have a bit of time for that. We have one person here. Thank you. The microphone is a bit weak, or does it? Yeah.
So the question, sorry. So my question is relating to the fact that we're aware, I suppose, in many jurisdictions where prosecutorial bodies might lean towards taking a case for a criminal offence that might not have the element of hatred because it might be easier to secure a conviction in some circumstances. And I suppose the question is, are there jurisdictions that you could point to who have taken an approach that's quite, that has managed to balance the need for due process rights and having definitions in legislation that mean that the approach taken is not that the threshold is too low to warrant a prosecution for a hate crime, but that also don't sort of dispense with, or that don't kind of lead towards a situation where they take the option of prosecuting for an ordinary offence? Or is it the case that actually resourcing becomes just as important as how the legislation is framed in the first place? Thank you.
Yeah, so I would probably refer to my own jurisdiction, which is England and Wales, where they have a similar system to which Ireland is proposing, where you can prove a aggravated offence either where someone is motivated by hostility or where someone demonstrates it. Now that is coupled with a very stringent policy, which is that you cannot plea the hate element off of the offence in order to just get a quick conviction. That's not obviously outlined in law, but it is outlined in policy, and our research suggested that that is not plead off. So if there is evidence of the hostility element, it will go before the court. Now, of course, if it goes before the court, it has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. So you have the criminal threshold, and you also then have the due process rights where you have a defence counsel which can provide a robust defence to that. If you only have the hostility element appearing at the sentencing stage, obviously those due process rights are somewhat limited. What often happens is it's filtered out of the system. So I think I've answered. Have I answered your question? I don't know what the policy on pleading off hate elements is in every country. But what you will find from the statistics is that outside of the UK, there are just very, very few successful prosecutions for hate crime, even in the United States. So we probably prosecute more hate crimes successfully in England and Wales than all other countries in Europe put together. That might be a good thing because it means we're taking hate crime more seriously and dealing with it more robustly. You could say it's a bad thing because the threshold's set too low. And I know that there would be people in this room that might consider the threshold too low. I would robustly defend that, both theoretically and practically.
Thank you. I would like to check. Yes, we have another question here.
Yeah, thanks a million. Thanks a million. It was a brilliant discussion. So I will have to use my two hats as a coalition coordinator and a civil liberties organization right now. I have two questions. I'll make it quick. So first of all, thanks a million to Lisa. It's fantastic to see that it has been announced, the publication of the legislation, and we really welcome the inclusion of sex characteristics for all the reasons listed by OII. Just to mention, I think that an element maybe that we didn't address here, we might address in the next discussions is the complexity of putting together incitement to hatred and hate crime legislation under the same bill. For example, for the consultation, we are very happy to hear that more consultation will happen with civil society. But for example, the consultation in Ireland originally was only on the incitement to hatred bit and not a hate crime, which tells us that we need to work more and more with civil society to ensure that that gets balanced. So one question for Mark Walters. in terms of this is my Civil Liberties Act, let's say. You were saying, and we've read a lot, I think we've heard a lot about the demonstration test being more effective at securing convictions. But from a civil liberties perspective, there are worries that if this is not complemented with community sentencing, restorative justice options, clear policy guidelines to judges and prosecutors, the focus of the hate crime legislation might heavily rely on the deterrent effect rather than on the actual social behavior change of the society. So this would be one question. And one very quick question for Lisa, as we're advancing with the legislation, we've heard a lot about the role of implementation measures. There's not yet been a commitment to a wider set of measures in the form of a national action plan. I wonder if there is an update on that. Thanks a million.
Mark?
Okay, I'll try and be quick, although it's a big question. So the first thing I would say is that conventionally hate crime legislation automatically equates with enhanced penalties. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There are some jurisdictions, and I can refer you to two in the United States, where the enhanced bit is a community order or a restorative justice element. So instead of giving someone a greater fine or more months in imprisonment, they have to go on either a rehabilitation course, participate in some kind of community work, and in Michigan at the moment, they're looking at a restorative justice activity as the enhanced bit. So that's one way of dealing with the underlying causes of hate. What I would say is that if you don't criminalize all of those crimes where there has been a demonstration of hatred that occurred during the commission of that offence, it could send a message out to society that you're not tackling hate crime seriously. It doesn't matter to the victim whether someone is, belongs to an extremist organisation and they have hatred in their heart and they've been sat at home for weeks planning their crime, or whether on the street they're attacked and during that attack they use homophobic or racist language. So the demonstration test for me is really important in encapsulating all of those offences where hatred or hostility is expressed during the commission of the act. The criminal law should recognise that to say this is a serious type of crime which has very marginalising and oppressive effects on entire communities. What you then do with that, once you've got the conviction, is a really important question. And for me, restorative justice, community and rehabilitation orders are much more effective than giving someone an extra £20 or 20 euros on their fine, which can often happen. Someone's fined £50 normally for a low-level offence and they get £70 in the UK if it's got a hate element. We need to be thinking much more intelligently about how we deal with the underlying causes of hate and the message that sends out.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you also for mentioning restorative justice. We may come back to that at a later stage. But
sorry, we have. Apologies, I'll be very quick. Just on the question of implementation, I'm speaking on the legislation, and it has taken all our efforts in the recent months to get this to this point. Conversations are ongoing within the department and with our other partners, and once we have enactment, which we hope to have by Christmas, then the work will really intensify on the accompanying implementation plan.
Thank you very much. I'm just checking if we have other questions or maybe online, but I don't think so because it's quite late and we're just behind schedule. It's been a very intense morning. So I think that everybody will allow that we can continue the conversation over lunch, which I think is served just here. So how handy is that? And we shall resume at 2:15. Is that what we said, right? So we stick to 2:15. So see.